Daniel Royce, a billionaire drunk on power, sat defiantly in Judge Naomi Sinclair's courtroom, refusing to stand for a black judge. He even mocked her, convinced he was untouchable. But with one bold move, Judge Sinclair didn't just put him in his place. She shook the entire justice system to its core. What happened next left the courtroom in utter shock. Tell us in the comments if you think justice is truly blind. And subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories. Let's begin. The courtroom was packed, buzzing with the kind of tension that only comes when the world is watching. Cameras lined the back of the room, reporters whispering, their pens flying across their notepads. Everyone knew this wasn't just another trial. This was a battle of power, arrogance, and justice. And at the center of it all sat Daniel Royce, billionaire, master manipulator, a man who had controlled industries, politicians, and even the law itself until now. But he wasn't acting like a man on trial. He lounged in his chair, arms crossed, a smirk curling his lips as if the courtroom was just another boardroom meeting he intended to dominate. The bailiff's voice echoed. All rise for the Honorable Judge Naomi Sinclair. Every person in the room stood. The attorneys, the journalists, even the spectators in the gallery. Everyone, except Daniel Royce. Gasps rippled through the room. Naomi Sinclair, the first black woman to hold this seat in the New York federal court, stepped up to the bench, her sharp gaze cutting through the tension. She had seen powerful men before, men who thought the rules didn't apply to them. But Daniel Royce took it to another level. She took her seat, her voice calm but firm. "Mr. Royce, in my courtroom, everyone stands when the judge enters." Daniel scoffed, his voice laced with mockery. "Not today." A ripple of unease spread through the attorney's table. Even his own legal team exchanged nervous glances. The cameras zoomed in. The world was watching. And then, just barely audible, he murmured, "Some judges need to learn their place." Naomi heard it. A flicker of something dark crossed her eyes, but she gave no reaction. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Instead, she tilted her head, observing him like a puzzle she had already solved. Then, with a steady hand, she reached for her gavel. Bam! The sound cracked through the air like a gunshot. The courtroom held its breath. Naomi locked eyes with Daniel Royce, her voice unwavering. "Bailiff." The uniformed officer stepped forward. "Yes, Your Honor." Naomi's lips barely moved. "Remove Mr. Royce from my courtroom." The smirk vanished from Daniel's face. "What?" Naomi didn't repeat herself. The bailiffs moved in. Daniel jerked back, his chair scraping against the floor. "You touch me, and I'll sue this entire court." The first officer grabbed his arm. Daniel snatched it back, his voice rising. "Don't you dare!" The courtroom erupted in chaos. Spectators gasped. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras clicked. Daniel lunged toward the bailiff, fists clenched. That was his mistake. The bailiffs moved like trained fighters. One yanked his arm behind his back. The other forced him over the defense table, pinning him down. Papers flew. His expensive watch clattered to the ground. "Do you know who I am?" Daniel roared, struggling. "You'll regret this, Sinclair." Naomi leaned back in her chair, watching the scene unfold as if she had seen it all before. She didn't need to say a word. Daniel Royce, the billionaire who once commanded the world, was being dragged out of her courtroom like a common criminal. And for the first time in his life, he had no control. Daniel Royce sat in the cold, windowless holding cell, his suit rumpled, his jaw tight. The billionaire who once dictated the fate of industries now sat on a metal bench, waiting for his attorney, waiting for his next move, waiting for the chance to turn this humiliating moment into his victory. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the hallway. The heavy steel door swung open, revealing Jonathan Reeves, his lead attorney, face pale and lips pressed into a thin line. The moment he stepped inside, he exhaled sharply. "What the hell was that?" Reeves snapped, pacing the cramped space. "You don't defy a federal judge like that." Daniel rolled his shoulders, shaking off the tension. "She wanted a show. I gave her one." Reeves stopped, eyes narrowing. "You think this is a joke? Naomi Sinclair just held you in contempt. She can keep you in here as long as she wants." Daniel's smirk returned, but it was darker this time. "Not for long." Reeves hesitated. "What are you planning?" Daniel leaned back, tapping his fingers against his knee. "Sinclair wants to prove she's in control. But control is an illusion. The media is already shifting the narrative. Watch how quickly she becomes the villain." Reeves ran a hand through his graying hair. Daniel. Call Holloway, Daniel interrupted. Reeves stiffened. You're bringing in Lawrence Holloway? Daniel's smile widened. I need a fixer, and Holloway knows how to handle problems. A long silence stretched between them. Then Reeves let out a resigned sigh. You realize you're escalating this to a war, right? Daniel's eyes gleamed. It already is. Back in her chambers, Naomi Sinclair sat at her desk, staring at the stack of documents in front of her. Her clerk, Daniel Langley, entered cautiously, holding a tablet. Judge, you might want to see this. She took it, glancing at the screen. The headlines hit like a punch to the gut. Rogue judge humiliates billionaire. Is this about power? Naomi Sinclair. Fair trial or personal vendetta? Abuse of power. Sinclair faces scrutiny over contempt charge. She set the tablet down slowly. That was fast. Langley's voice was tight. Daniel Royce's PR team is already spinning this. The public's starting to question your objectivity. Naomi inhaled deeply, keeping her face unreadable. She expected pushback. But this fast? That meant Royce had planned this. Schedule a meeting with the Chief Justice, she said finally. We need to get ahead of this. Langley hesitated. You think they'll push to have you removed? Naomi's jaw clenched. If Royce has his way, yes. Later that evening, Daniel Royce sat comfortably in his holding cell, a tablet in hand, watching the media frenzy unfold. A slow smirk curled on his lips. The plan was working. The steel door creaked open. Lawrence Holloway stepped inside, immaculately dressed, his expression unreadable. The kind of lawyer billionaires called when they didn't just want to win, they wanted to bury their enemies. He set his briefcase down and studied Daniel for a long moment before speaking. You've made a mess. Daniel chuckled. I made a spectacle. Holloway's brow lifted slightly. And now Sinclair is making calls. The Judiciary Committee might get involved. Daniel leaned forward, eyes gleaming. Then it's time we take the fight to her. Holloway opened his briefcase, pulling out a folder. We already have something. Daniel took it, scanning the contents. His smirk widened. Let's make sure Naomi Sinclair regrets ever stepping into that courtroom. Naomi Sinclair sat across from Chief Justice Roland Hayes. The latest headlines spread between them. They're coming after you hard, Naomi, Hayes said. The committee is already receiving calls about your impartiality. Naomi didn't blink. This isn't about impartiality. This is about Daniel Royce manipulating the system. Hayes sighed. Even so, perception matters. She exhaled. Royce wasn't just fighting in court, he was fighting in the media. What are my options? She asked. Hayes hesitated. You could recuse yourself. Naomi's jaw tightened. That's exactly what Royce wanted. Or fight back. But Royce plays dirty. If you make this a war, it won't stop at your career. Naomi's gaze didn't waver. Then let's go to war. Back in her office, Naomi met with David Ramirez, the lead prosecutor. He dropped a folder onto her desk. We have enough to bury Royce, but the public isn't seeing it. Naomi opened the file. Financial fraud, market manipulation, bribery. Hard proof. But none of it mattered if the public believed she was the problem. She tapped her fingers against the desk. We need to control the narrative. Ramirez nodded. How? Naomi's expression hardened. We leaked the real story. Ramirez hesitated. You're suggesting we fight media fire with fire? She held up the folder. Royce has painted himself as the victim. It's time the world sees who he really is. Ramirez exhaled. I know a journalist who won't bow to pressure. Naomi nodded. Then it's time we play by Royce's rules. That night, Daniel Royce lounged in his holding cell, watching the news. His smirk remained until the broadcast shifted. Breaking, new evidence unveiled in Royce trial. His brows furrowed as the anchor continued. Previously unseen documents reveal the true extent of Royce's fraudulent dealings. Experts suggest this could turn the tide in the case. The screen cut to a whistleblower interview. I worked for Royce Industries for years, the man said. We were ordered to falsify reports, intimidate regulators, and bury evidence. Royce's smirk disappeared. A knock at the door. Lawrence Holloway stepped in, his face unreadable. We have a problem. Royce turned off the TV, jaw tight. Fix it. Holloway exhaled. It's too late. The prosecution just got their momentum back. For the first time, Daniel Royce felt control slipping through his fingers. Naomi Sinclair entered the courtroom with quiet determination. The air was heavier now, the stakes higher. The leaked documents had shifted public perception, but Royce wasn't done fighting. If anything, he was more dangerous than ever. As she took her seat, she caught Royce's gaze, smug, unshaken. But there was something else, a flicker of something darker. Desperation disguised as confidence. "All rise," the bailiff announced. The room stood, including Royce this time. Naomi gave a slight nod and signaled for the proceedings to begin. David Ramirez stood. "Your Honor, given recent revelations regarding Mr. Royce's history of financial crimes, the prosecution formally requests that his bail be revoked and that he remain in custody for the remainder of this trial." Naomi's expression didn't change. "Mr. Holloway, your response?" Lawrence Holloway adjusted his tie and stood. Calm, measured. "Your Honor, the media frenzy surrounding my client is precisely why he should be granted bail. The court cannot allow a trial to be influenced by public opinion. My client is neither a flight risk nor a danger to society." A quiet murmur rippled through the gallery. Naomi tapped her gavel lightly. "Order." She turned to Ramirez. "Do you have any additional evidence supporting your request?" Ramirez hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Yes, Your Honor. Surveillance footage." At his cue, a screen in the courtroom lit up, playing a grainy black and white video. The room fell silent as they watched. It showed Royce speaking to an unidentified man inside the holding facility. There was no audio, but the body language was clear. A handshake, a slip of paper exchanged, a nod. Naomi's eyes narrowed. "What am I looking at, Mr. Ramirez?" Ramirez turned to face her. "This was recorded 2 nights ago. The man Royce met with was a known associate of a private security firm suspected of witness intimidation." A ripple of whispers filled the air. Royce's smirk faltered for the first time. Naomi leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Royce, do you care to explain this?" Royce exhaled slowly, then shook his head. "I don't even know who that man is." Ramirez didn't miss a beat. "Then why did he enter your holding cell in the middle of the night? And why did you pass him a note?" Holloway cleared his throat. "Your Honor, this is speculation. We don't even know what was on that note." Naomi considered this for a moment, then turned back to Ramirez. "Do you have the note?" Ramirez nodded. "Forensics recovered it." He held up a sealed evidence bag. Inside was a small slip of paper with only 4 words written on it. "Make it go away." The courtroom exploded. Gasps, murmurs, the sound of reporters furiously scribbling notes. Naomi's gavel slammed down. Silence. She took a breath, then looked directly at Royce. "Bail is denied. Mr. Royce will remain in custody until trial's conclusion." Royce's jaw tensed. Holloway leaned in, whispering something. Naomi watched as Royce's hands clenched into fists, the mask of arrogance slipping just for a second. She had won this round. But something in Royce's expression told her this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Daniel Royce sat in his holding cell with a feeling that his carefully curated life was crumbling, and for the first time he wasn't in control. Across from him, Lawrence Holloway sat with his briefcase open. Royce had hired him for moments like this, for fixing problems. "The media isn't buying the victim act anymore," Holloway said, flipping through a file. "And with that surveillance footage, the case against you is airtight." Royce exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening. "So, what's our move?" Holloway closed the file. "We go scorched earth." A slow smirk crept onto Royce's face. "Now we're talking." The next morning, Naomi Sinclair arrived at the courthouse under heavier security. She had expected retaliation, but even she wasn't prepared for what awaited her. Her clerk, Daniel Langley, rushed up to her, his face pale. "Judge, we have a situation." She took the tablet from his hands and scanned the latest headline. "Breaking explosive allegations against Judge Sinclair, conflict of interest revealed." Naomi's pulse remained steady, but a cold dread settled in her gut. She tapped the article, scrolling through accusations of bias, secret dealings, and unverified financial ties to Royce's competitors. She turned to Langley. "Where's this coming from?" "Anonymous sources. Royce's team must have planted it." Naomi exhaled sharply. "Then we fight back." Inside the courtroom, Royce sat beside Holloway, the smugness back in his expression. Naomi entered, her face unreadable. As soon as the session began, Holloway stood. "Your Honor, we have urgent matters to address before we proceed." Naomi gestured for him to continue. Holloway picked up a folder. "New evidence has surfaced that calls into question your ability to preside over this case fairly." Gasps filled the courtroom. Even Ramirez tensed beside her. Naomi kept her expression neutral. What evidence? Holloway handed a stack of documents to the bailiff, who passed them to her. Bank statements, emails, fabricated connections. These documents suggest you have personal and financial ties to organizations that have directly benefited from Mr. Royce's downfall. Naomi remained still. And where did this evidence come from? Holloway didn't flinch. An anonymous whistleblower. Lies. All of it. The tension in the courtroom thickened. Naomi glanced at Ramirez, who was already flipping through the files, shaking his head. This was Royce's endgame. If she reacted emotionally, she'd lose. If she didn't address it, the damage would spread. She set the papers down and met Royce's eyes. Cold, calculated. Then she spoke. Nice try. The courtroom buzzed with tension. Royce sat back, smirking, believing he had finally cornered her. Naomi Sinclair, however, remained composed. She picked up the fabricated documents and turned them over, tapping her fingers lightly against the table. Then, she did something no one expected. She laughed. A stunned silence filled the room. Royce's smirk faltered for just a second. Holloway tensed beside him. Naomi leaned forward slightly, eyes locked onto Royce's. Let me get this straight. Her voice was calm, almost amused. You want this court to believe that a judge with an impeccable career suddenly decided to take financial bribes to ensure the downfall of a man whose crimes are already well documented? She flipped through the papers, shaking her head. It's a bold move, I'll give you that. Holloway cleared his throat. Your Honor, these allegations, Naomi raised a hand, are as fake as your client's moral compass. Gasps erupted. Even Ramirez looked surprised. Royce's fingers curled into fists, but Naomi wasn't finished. She turned to Ramirez. How long did it take you to find the inconsistencies? Ramirez smirked. Less than 5 minutes, Your Honor. Naomi tapped her gavel lightly. Let's go ahead and make it official then. Ramirez stood. Your Honor, we request an immediate forensic analysis of these documents. If they are fraudulent, as we suspect, Mr. Royce and his legal team could face additional charges for presenting false evidence in a federal court. Holloway's face darkened. Royce's smirk was gone. Naomi nodded. Motion granted. Court is adjourned until we have the results. The gavel came down. Royce had played his hand and lost. 2 days later, Naomi sat in her chambers when Langley walked in, a file in hand. His expression said it all. It's confirmed, he said. The documents were forged. We traced them back to a shell company linked to Royce's business. Naomi leaned back, exhaling. Then it's time to end this. The courtroom was silent, not the kind of silence that comes with boredom, but the kind that grips, that weighs heavy on the air. Naomi Sinclair sat at the bench, her expression unreadable, but inside, she knew this was the moment that everything would change. Daniel Royce sat at the defense table, his usual smug confidence noticeably absent. This was it. Naomi tapped her gavel. Court is now in session. David Ramirez stood first. Your Honor, as per the forensic analysis, the evidence submitted by the defense was fraudulent. He paused for effect before continuing. Furthermore, we have traced these forged documents back to a shell company directly tied to Daniel Royce's corporate empire. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Royce sat still, his jaw tightening. Holloway, his attorney, did his best to appear composed, but even he knew the walls were closing in. Naomi turned to Holloway. Mr. Holloway, do you have a response before I proceed? Holloway hesitated before standing. Your Honor, we have reason to believe that. Naomi raised a hand. Save it. Her voice was firm. This court does not tolerate manipulation of the legal system. Mr. Royce and his defense team attempted to obstruct justice, and that will not go unpunished. She turned to Royce directly. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Royce clenched his jaw before finally speaking. This is a witch hunt. Naomi leaned back. A witch hunt? She let the words settle before shaking her head. No, Mr. Royce, this is justice. A deep breath, then the decision. Daniel Royce, this court finds you guilty on all charges, including fraud, obstruction of justice, and bribery. Gasps filled the room. Reporters scrambled to get the news out. The mighty billionaire had fallen. Naomi continued. Sentencing will be scheduled at a later date. However, given the severity of your offenses, you will remain in custody. Royce's hands tightened into fists. His empire, his influence, his control, gone. Naomi tapped her gavel one final time. Court is adjourned. As she stood, She locked eyes with Royce. This wasn't just about one case. It was about proving that no one, not even a billionaire who thought he was untouchable, was above the law. For the first time, Royce had nothing left to say. Naomi stepped into her chambers, closing the door behind her. The noise from the courtroom still lingered in her ears. But in here, in this moment, she could finally breathe. Her clerk, Daniel Langley, walked in, a cautious smile on his face. "It's done." David Ramirez followed close behind. "Justice was served today, Judge." Naomi exhaled slowly. For now, she knew this wasn't just about Daniel Royce. There would always be another trial, another powerful figure trying to bend the law to their will, another fight to prove that justice was more than just a word. This case had been a battle, but in the end, it wasn't just Naomi who won. It was the people who believed that fairness, truth, and integrity still mattered. But what do you think? Do you believe the justice system truly holds the powerful accountable, or was Royce just one of the few who got caught? Let us know in the comments. We want to hear your thoughts on this case, the verdict, and the deeper issues at play. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching. Your support means everything to us. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories just like this one. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and never stop seeking justice.